May 1942. Over the steamy jungles of New Guinea, the sky belonged to Japan. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai banked his Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, a machine so light and responsive it felt like an extension of his own nervous system. Below him, a lone American P-40 Warhawk lumbered through the humid air, its pilot completely unaware of the predator circling in the sun above. To Sakai, one of the elite aces of the Tainan Air Group, this was not a battle. It was a foregone conclusion, a demonstration of an absolute and, he believed, spiritual truth. The Americans were clumsy, their machines were heavy, and their pilots lacked the warrior spirit of the samurai. He transmitted a calm message to his two wingmen, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Toshio Ota. "You two stay up here. I will take this one alone." It was almost an act of pity. The Zero descended like a hawk, its 20mm cannons silent for now. Sakai wanted the American to see him, to understand the futility of his situation before the end. The P-40 pilot, seeing the sleek Japanese fighter closing in with impossible speed, did what every Allied pilot had been trained to do. He panicked and tried to turn. It was a fatal mistake. The Zero, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds less than its American counterpart and designed with a fanatical devotion to maneuverability, could turn on a razor's edge. Sakai easily slipped onto the Warhawk's tail, the American plane now filling his gun sight. He could have ended it in a single burst, but the display of superiority was the point. For several minutes, he toyed with the American, effortlessly following every desperate twist and turn, a master swordsman disarming a novice. The American pilot, his machine shuddering under the strain, could not shake the ghost latched to his tail. Finally, his lesson delivered. Sakai squeezed the trigger. The Zero's cannons and machine guns erupted, tearing the P-40's fuselage to ribbons. The American fighter, trailing smoke and glycol, plunged into the emerald canopy below. For Sakai and his comrades, it was just another victory, another confirmation of their invincibility. They did not mock the Americans with laughter. Their contempt was colder, more profound. It was the serene confidence of the chosen, the absolute conviction that their aircraft, their training, and their spirit were simply superior. This scene, repeated with grim frequency across the Pacific, was the terrifying reality of the air war in early 1942. The arrival of the Mitsubishi A6M, known to the Allies as the Zero, had been a cataclysm. American and British pilots, flying rugged but sluggish planes like the Grumman F4F Wildcat and the Brewster Buffalo, found themselves completely outclassed. The Zero could outclimb them, outturn them, and fly farther than them. Its performance at the outset of the war was so revolutionary that many early Allied intelligence reports dismissed pilot accounts as exaggerated panic. No fighter, they believed, could possess such capabilities, but the losses were undeniable. The Zero's kill ratio against Allied aircraft was staggering, reaching as high as 12-1 in some encounters. Japanese naval aviators, the product of a brutal and hyper-selective training program that washed out over 70% of its candidates, were the best trained pilots in the world. Men like Sakai were not just pilots. They were aerial samurai, imbued with the warrior code of Bushido and an unwavering belief in the supremacy of the Japanese race. They flew with a precision and aggression that left their opponents bewildered. Their doctrine was built around the dogfight, the one-on-one duel where superior skill and a superior aircraft would always prevail. And in the Zero, they had the perfect instrument for this philosophy. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the A6M was an aeronautical marvel, a fusion of power and minimalism. To achieve its phenomenal performance, Horikoshi had stripped away everything considered non-essential: armor plating for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural durability. The aircraft was a delicate scalpel in a sky full of hammers, and in the hands of an expert, it was unstoppable. Back in San Diego, Lieutenant Commander John Thach, a skilled aviator and the commander of Fighting Squadron 3, read the combat reports from the Coral Sea and Midway with mounting frustration. The pages were filled with the names of friends, young pilots lost to the seemingly magical capabilities of the Zero. The official guidance given to his men was a bitter pill to swallow. If a Zero is on your tail, do not try to dogfight it. Do not try to out-turn it. Your only hope is to dive away and pray your heavier American plane can outrun it. Thach knew this was not a strategy for victory. It was a recipe for attrition, a way to merely survive. He refused to accept it. His men flew the Grumman F6F Wildcat, a plane affectionately nicknamed the Grumman Iron Works. It was the polar opposite of the Zero. The Wildcat was tough, heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment. Its pilots were protected by armor plate, and its fuel tanks could seal themselves after being punctured. But it was slow, a poor climber, and in a turning fight with a Zero, it was a death trap. Thach knew that sending his pilots to fight the Japanese one-on-one was suicide. The problem consumed him. For weeks, he spent his nights at his dining room table, sketching diagrams on napkins, pushing matchsticks around to represent aircraft formations. He was not trying to design a better plane. That was a job for the engineers back at Grumman, a solution that was years away. He needed a way to win now, with the planes he had. The core of the problem was tactical. American pilots, like their Japanese counterparts, had been trained in the tradition of individual combat, of the ace as a lone wolf. But how could you win a duel when your opponent's sword was longer and sharper? Thach's breakthrough came from a simple, yet revolutionary realization. Stop thinking in terms of one-on-one duels. He had to devise a tactic that used the Wildcat's strengths, its durability and firepower, while neutralizing the Zero's turning advantage. The answer was teamwork. The idea that began to form with those matchsticks was a cooperative maneuver, a defensive tactic that relied on two or more pilots working together. He envisioned a pair of Wildcats flying side by side. When a Zero latched onto the tail of one Wildcat, the two American planes would turn toward each other. This simple, counterintuitive move was the heart of his idea. The Zero, intent on its target, would have to follow the first Wildcat in its turn. As the two American planes passed each other, the targeted pilot's wingman would be presented with a perfect head-on shot at the pursuing Zero. The hunter would instantly become the hunted. The Zero pilot would be trapped in a lethal dilemma, either break off the attack or fly directly into the guns of the second Wildcat. Thach called his concept beam defense position, but it would soon become famous under a different name, the Thach Weave. It was a tactic that transformed two vulnerable targets into a mutually defending fortress of firepower. It shifted the fight from a contest of individual maneuverability to a geometric puzzle of intersecting fire. It was a beautiful, deadly solution. But it existed only on paper. Thach had no way of knowing if it would actually work in the chaos of three-dimensional combat. He and his squadron practiced the weave relentlessly in the clear skies over California, the Wildcats carving graceful, intersecting patterns. He needed to prove it in battle, to convince a skeptical Navy that this strange aerial square dance was the answer to the Zero. He believed in it, but his faith was untested. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy continued their reign of terror, supremely confident that no American pilot and no American machine could ever challenge their mastery of the sky. Their hubris was boundless, forged in the fires of 100 victories. They had no idea that a handful of matchsticks on a dining room table in San Diego had already sealed their fate. The first real test of Thach's desperate theory came on June 4, 1942, in the crucible of the Battle of Midway. Leading a 6-plane escort for a flight of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Thach and his wingman, machinist Tom Cheek, climbed into a sky swarming with Japanese fighters. 20 Zeros from the carrier Hiryu descended upon them. Within moments, the disciplined American formation was a swirling chaos of individual dogfights, and the Wildcats were losing badly. One by one, Thach's pilots were picked off, their sturdy but slow fighters no match for the nimble Zeros. Over the radio, he heard the screams and the final garbled transmissions as his squadron was annihilated. Thach found himself in a nightmare scenario, with a Zero locked firmly on his tail and another shadowing his wingman. Diving away was not an option. They were too low, and the Zeros were too close. This was it. The matchsticks on the dining room table had become a matter of life and death. He keyed his radio, his voice miraculously calm. "Tom, follow my lead. Do as I do." He banked his Wildcat hard, turning towards Cheek's plane. The Japanese pilot on his tail, Lieutenant Kenji Koga, was a veteran of Pearl Harbor, a confident ace who had never lost a dogfight. He watched the American plane turn and instinctively followed, tightening his own turn to keep his gun sight centered. It was a classic, predictable maneuver, the last gasp of a doomed pilot. But then Koga saw something that made no sense. The other American fighter was also turning, not away, but directly toward him. The geometry of the fight was suddenly wrong. The two American planes were closing on each other, seemingly about to collide, with Koga trapped in the middle. For a split second, he was paralyzed by confusion. This was not how air combat worked. The American pilot he was chasing was now flashing across his nose, and in its place, the second Wildcat was growing larger in his windscreen, its wings sparkling with the distinct, terrifying flashes of 6.50 caliber machine guns. Koga had flown directly into a wall of lead. There was no time to react. The heavy American slugs, armor-piercing and incendiary, tore through his plane's unarmored fuselage and fragile wing tanks. Koga's Zero, a machine built without an ounce of defensive armor, simply came apart in the air, a cloud of flame and aluminum confetti. Thach and Cheek completed their weave, their planes now crisscrossing in a defensive scythe. From the cockpit of another Zero, Petty Officer Susumu Ito watched his leader disintegrate and was baffled. The Americans were not fighting. They were flying in a strange, deliberate pattern. He selected one of the Wildcats and dove to attack, easily closing the distance and latching onto its tail. As he prepared to fire, the American plane turned inward again, toward its partner. Remembering Koga's fate, Ito hesitated, breaking off his attack to reassess. In that moment of hesitation, the second Wildcat flashed past, its guns silent, but its threat implicit. The Americans were using their mutual vulnerability as a weapon. They were inviting attack, turning a defensive liability into an offensive trap. For the next several minutes, Thach and Cheek repeated the weave again and again. Every time a Zero tried to gain a firing position, the Wildcats would turn towards each other, presenting the attacker with the impossible choice of abandoning the kill or facing a head-on barrage. The Japanese pilots, masters of the one-on-one duel, were utterly flummoxed. They circled the two weaving Wildcats like frustrated wolves, unable to land a decisive blow. Thach, though his plane was damaged and his squadron was gone, had proven his theory. He had found a way to make the Wildcat fight the Zero and win. He had survived, and more importantly, he had found the antidote. The Thach Weave was not a secret for long. It was immediately implemented as standard doctrine throughout the US Navy and Marine Corps, giving beleaguered Wildcat pilots a fighting chance. But Thach himself knew it was a stopgap. It was a brilliant tactic that could save lives, but it was still a defensive measure. To truly win the war, America needed a better machine. That machine was already taking shape on the factory floor of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York. Even before Pearl Harbor, Grumman's lead designer, Jake Swerble, and its founder, Leroy Grumman, had been paying close attention to combat reports from Europe and China. They knew the Wildcat, for all its ruggedness, was at the limits of its development. They had begun work on a successor, the XF6F1. But the early design was proving underwhelming, powered by the same Wright Cyclone engine that had failed to give the Brewster Buffalo an edge. The shock of the Zero's performance after Pearl Harbor changed everything. The Navy sent an urgent request: build a fighter that can beat the Zero, not just survive against it, but dominate it. The Grumman team, in an unprecedented move, began an intense dialogue with their customers, the combat pilots. They listened to the reports from Thach, from Butch O'Hare, and from dozens of other flyers returning from the Pacific. The feedback was consistent. They needed more speed, and especially more climb. They needed to be able to dictate the terms of the fight, to engage or disengage at will. The answer was power. In a bold decision, the Grumman team scrapped their original design and decided to build their new fighter around the most powerful aircraft engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp. This 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine was a 2,000 horsepower monster, a power plant that had been designed for bombers and large transport planes. Stuffing it into the sleek fuselage of a carrier-base fighter was an engineering challenge of the highest order. The result, Ting aircraft, was enormous. When the first prototype, now designated the XF6F-3, was rolled out on June 26, 1942, it dwarfed the Wildcat beside it. It was bigger, heavier, and more imposing than any single-engine fighter the Navy had ever seen. Test pilots, accustomed to the nimbler Wildcat, were skeptical. It looked less like a fighter and more like a delivery truck with wings. They nicknamed it the Iron Works big-ass brother. But the moment test pilot Selden Connie Converse pushed the throttle forward and the double Wasp roared to life, all doubts vanished. The new fighter, officially named the Hellcat, did not just fly, it clawed its way into the sky with a ferocious, unrelenting climb rate that left the Wildcat in its dust. The design philosophy of the Hellcat was the industrial might of America made manifest. Where the Zero was light and agile, the Hellcat was heavy and powerful. Where the Zero was fragile, the Hellcat was a flying tank, with a cockpit wrapped in armor plate, a bullet-resistant windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb .30 caliber rounds without leaking. Its broad, sturdy wings housed 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, the same armament as the Wildcat, but with a much larger ammunition capacity, 400 rounds per gun. This was not a scalpel, it was a sledgehammer. Grumman engineers had deliberately avoided innovation for innovation's sake. They used the same rugged landing gear design from the Wildcat, known to withstand the brutal punishment of carrier landings. The controls were simple and effective. The entire aircraft was designed for mass production and ease of maintenance. It was a weapon made to be built by the thousands and flown by 20-year-old pilots with 200 hours of flight time. It was everything the Zero was not: durable, heavily armed, and brutally powerful. The first production models began rolling off the Bethpage assembly line in late 1942. As squadron after squadron traded in their worn-out Wildcats for the big, blue new fighter, a sense of confidence began to spread through the Navy's air arm. The Thach Weave had given them a tactic to survive. The Hellcat promised them a tool to dominate. In the skies over the South Pacific, Saburo Sakai and the remaining aces of the Imperial Japanese Navy continued their lonely war, their skills honed to a razor's edge, their faith in the Zero unshaken. They had heard rumors of a new American fighter, but they dismissed them. The Americans built clumsy, heavy planes. It was a law of nature. They had no idea that an avalanche of steel, powered by 2,000 horses and guided by a new, deadly tactical doctrine, was about to descend upon them. The era of the aerial samurai was about to come to a violent and decisive end. The reckoning began on August 31st, 1943, over Marcus Island, a tiny, heavily defended Japanese outpost 1,000 miles from Tokyo. The pilots of Fighter Squadron 5, flying from the new carrier USS Yorktown, were the first to take the F6F Hellcat into combat. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Vejtasa, a seasoned veteran and Wildcat ace who had survived the slaughter at the Battle of Santa Cruz. He understood the Zero's deadly capabilities better than almost anyone. As his flight of Hellcats approached the island, Japanese Zeros rose to meet them, their pilots expecting another easy kill against what they assumed were just larger, clumsier Wildcats. The Japanese commander, seeing the big American fighters, signaled his pilots to engage in a classic turning dogfight, a very tactic that had guaranteed their dominance for nearly 2 years. For Vejtasa, this was the moment of truth. A Zero latched onto the tail of one of his junior pilots. In his old Wildcat, Vejtasa would have had to dive away or set up a defensive weave. But this was a Hellcat. He pushed the throttle forward, and the double Wasp engine responded with a deep-throated roar. The sensation was exhilarating. Instead of struggling for altitude, the Hellcat surged upward, closing on the attacking Zero with astonishing speed. The Japanese pilot, completely focused on his prey, never saw him coming. Vejtasa lined up the shot, his 6 machine guns converging on the fragile Japanese plane. He pressed the firing stud. The Hellcat shuddered as a torrent of .50 caliber rounds, nearly 100 per second, slammed into the Zero. The enemy aircraft didn't trail smoke or spiral gracefully into the sea. It simply vanished in a flash of orange and black, disintegrating as if it had been swatted from the sky. The other Japanese pilots broke off their attacks, their perfect formation dissolving into confusion. The rules of engagement had just been violently rewritten. This scene became the new reality across the Pacific. On October 5th, over Wake Island, the Hellcats of VF-6 from the USS Independence engaged a large formation of Zeros. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vraciu, on his first combat tour, found himself in a swirling dogfight. A Zero attempted to turn inside his Hellcat, a maneuver that would have been fatal against a Wildcat. Vraciu, remembering his training, resisted the urge to turn. Instead, he kicked his rudder, skidding the big fighter sideways to get his guns on target for a fleeting moment, and fired a quick burst. The rounds ripped through the Zero's cockpit, and it fell away. Later in the same fight, Vraciu saw a Zero diving on a friendly plane. He rolled his Hellcat over and plunged into a dive. The Zero pilot, seeing the massive I can fighter closing in his rearview mirror at an impossible speed, panicked. The Hellcat's weight, once seen as a disadvantage, became a devastating weapon in a dive. It could reach speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, far faster than the lightweight Zero. Vraciu easily overhauled his opponent, opened fire, and watched the Zero explode. In a single day, the Hellcats of Carrier Air Group 6 shot down 21 Japanese fighters for the loss of 6 of their own, a kill ratio that was a stunning reversal of the war's early days. The Japanese pilots who survived and limped back to their bases were in a state of shock. Their post-action reports were filled with disbelief. The new American fighter was a monster. It could climb with them, it could outdive them, and it could absorb damage that would have vaporized a Zero. One Japanese pilot reported putting multiple 20mm cannon shells directly into a Hellcat's engine, only to watch in horror as the big blue fighter continued to fly, trailing smoke but still under control, its pilot eventually bailing out safely. The psychological impact on the once invincible Japanese naval aviators was profound. Their entire combat philosophy was built on the Zero's superior maneuverability. Now, they were facing an enemy who refused to play their game. American pilots, drilled in the new doctrine of boom and zoom tactics, used the Hellcat's superior power to dictate the fight. They would climb to a higher altitude, select a target, and then dive at incredible speed, firing a single devastating pass before using their momentum to climb back up into the sun, leaving the Zeros circling helplessly below. If a Hellcat pilot made a mistake and a Zero did get on his tail, the Thach Weave provided a deadly escape. But with the Hellcat's superior performance, the Weave was no longer just a defensive measure. A pair of Hellcats could now actively hunt Zeros, intentionally luring one into the trap. The targeted Hellcat would begin a turn, drawing the Zero in, while its wingman, instead of just covering, would use his superior speed to slash across the circle and annihilate the attacker. The trap closed faster and with more violence than it ever had with the sluggish Wildcats. Saburo Sakai, recovering from grievous wounds that had cost him the sight in one eye, heard the stories from the front lines and was deeply troubled. Young, inexperienced pilots were being sent into combat against this new American monster, and they were not coming back. He wrote in his diary, "The Americans were no longer fighting with brute force, but with intelligence and a superior new fighter. Our cherished dog-fighting tactics, once our greatest strength, were now being used against us as a lure into a deadly trap." The industrial mathematics of the war were becoming brutally clear. While Japan struggled to produce a few hundred Zeros per month, Grumman's Bethpage factory, known as the Iron Works, was a volcano of production. By 1944, they were rolling out more than 600 Hellcats a month. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a swarm of 30,000 workers, many of them women, building the complex machines with astonishing speed and precision. The Hellcat was explicitly designed for this reality. Its systems were simple, its maintenance straightforward. When a battle-damaged Hellcat returned to its carrier, maintenance crews could often replace a cylinder, patch a wing, and have the aircraft ready to fly again in a matter of hours. A damaged Zero was often a total wreck, ITOF. America was not just replacing its losses, it was burying the Japanese under an avalanche of production. The quality of the pilots was also shifting. While Japan's elite pre-war pilot corps had been decimated at Midway and Guadalcanal, America's massive training pipeline was now producing thousands of well-trained, confident young aviators. They arrived in the Pacific with hundreds of hours of flight time, including extensive training in the Hellcat itself. They had studied the Thach Weave, practiced boom and zoom tactics, and memorized the Zero's weaknesses. They were not the bewildered novices of 1942. They were confident professionals arriving in a superior machine. The unraveling culminated in the air battles over Rabaul in late 1943. The Japanese concentrated their best remmer, inning veteran pilots at this fortress stronghold to halt the American advance. What followed was a systematic slaughter. Day after day, formations of Hellcats would sweep over the Japanese airfields. The Japanese pilots rose to meet them, fighting with desperate courage, but they were technologically and tactically overwhelmed. In 5 major air battles between October and November, the US Navy claimed nearly 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of fewer than 30 Hellcats. The last of Japan's pre-war aces, the aerial samurai who had terrorized the Pacific, were wiped out. Their confidence, their doctrine, and their aura of invincibility were shattered against a wall of American horsepower and firepower. The laughter had stopped. The contempt had vanished. All that remained was a growing, gnawing fear. In the ready rooms of Japanese carriers, a new name was whispered for the big, blue American fighter, the Ace Maker. The strategic shift was no longer a gradual change. It was a seismic event that shook the foundations of Japanese military strategy. The aerial slaughter over Rabaul had effectively broken the back of Japanese naval aviation. For the first time in the war, the United States Navy had achieved what it had desperately sought since Pearl Harbor: air superiority. This was not just a tactical advantage, it was the key that would unlock the entire Pacific. With control of the skies, the American fleet could move with impunity its carriers safe from the threat of air attack, and its amphibious forces able to land on island after island without fear of being strafed and bombed into submission. The Hellcat, in concert with the Thach Weave, had become the iron broom that was sweeping the Japanese the sky. The legacy of this new reality would be written in blood and fire at a place that would enter naval history as the site of the most lopsided air battle ever fought, the Philippine Sea. By June 1944, the American war machine was rolling toward Japan's inner defensive perimeter. The target was the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Capturing these islands would put American B-29 bombers within striking range of the Japanese home islands, a mortal threat that the Imperial Japanese Navy could not ignore. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese fleet, devised a bold plan, codenamed A-Go. He would lure the American Fifth Fleet into a decisive battle and annihilate it with his carrier aircraft. Ozawa's confidence, though shaken, was not entirely broken. He believed he held several key advantages. His aircraft, flying from a greater distance, could strike the American carriers while his own fleet remained safely out of range of a counterattack. After striking the American ships, his planes would land and refuel on the airfields of Guam and Rota before returning to their carriers. Furthermore, he was counting on the superior quality of his new aircraft models, like the Zeke Model 52, an improved Zero, and the Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber. His pilots, though inexperienced compared to the lost veterans of 1942, were filled with a fanatical, self-sacrificing spirit. He believed this combination of tactical advantage and spiritual superiority would be enough to overcome America's brute industrial force. What Ozawa did not know was that he was sailing into a technological and tactical buzzsaw. The American Fifth Fleet, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. At its heart were 15 aircraft carriers, carrying over 900 aircraft, the vast majority of which were F6F Hellcats. The American carriers themselves were now bristling with a new defensive weapon that was as revolutionary as the Hellcat itself: the proximity fuse. These artillery shells, equipped with a tiny radar, could detonate automatically when they passed near an enemy aircraft, filling the sky with lethal clouds of shrapnel. The era of needing a direct hit to down a plane was over. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched his first wave of 69 aircraft. The American fleet, alerted by its superior radar, was waiting. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Hellcats of the USS Essex, gave the order: "Get the Hellcats." From the decks of a dozen carriers, the big blue fighters roared into the sky. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. American fighter directors, watching the Japanese formations approach on their radar screens, vectored the Hellcats to intercept them with perfect precision. The Japanese pilots, flying into the teeth of this perfectly coordinated defense, were massacred. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, the same pilot who had scored his first kills over Wake Island, now an experienced ace, led his division into the fray. He described it as a hunter's dream. The Japanese formations were rigid, their pilots lacking the skill to react to the high-speed diving attacks of the Hellcats. Vraciu himself shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in just 8 minutes, his Hellcats' guns pouring out streams of .50 caliber rounds that tore the fragile Japanese planes apart. He returned to the USS Lexington with his ammunition nearly exhausted, holding up 6 fingers to the cheering deck crew. All across the sky, it was the same story. The Thach Weave was employed with lethal efficiency. Hellcat sections would descend on the Japanese formations, with one element engaging the escorting Zeros, while another ripped through the helpless bombers. Japanese pilots who survived the Hellcat attacks then had to fly through the fleet's anti-aircraft fire, a sky filled with the black puffs of proximity-fused shells. Of the 69 aircraft in Ozawa's first wave, 42 were shot down before they ever saw an American ship. The few that broke through were picked off by the ship's guns. Not a single American vessel was seriously damaged. Ozawa, stunned by the failure, doubled down, launching a second, even larger wave of 128 aircraft. The result was the same. The American fighter directors, coolly managing the battle from their radar plots, positioned their Hellcats perfectly. The Japanese planes were shot down in droves. Pilots from the USS Hornet dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The radio chatter from the American pilots was a mixture of professional calm and giddy disbelief. "Splash one Zeke! There's another one! Get him! This is like an old-time turkey shoot." By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 370 aircraft and 2 of their carriers. The American losses were a mere 30 planes and minor damage to a single battleship. Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The Hellcat had not just won a battle, it had annihilated its enemy. The legacy was clear and undeniable. The combination of a superior aircraft, a superior tactical doctrine, and superior pilot training had created a synergy that was unbeatable. The Hellcat became the ultimate symbol of American industrial and tactical philosophy. Overwhelm the enemy with power, durability, and firepower. It was the machine that broke the cult of the Zero and erased the myth of the invincible aerial samurai. By the end of the war, F6F Hellcats would be credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. Its final kill-to-loss ratio was a staggering 19-1. The pilots who flew it, men like McCampbell, Vraciu, and Vejtasa, became legends. Their success built on the foundation of the lessons learned in the dark days of 1942 and the revolutionary ideas tested with matchsticks on a dining room table. The era of the dogfight was over. The era of integrated, technology-driven air power had begun. The journey from the confident contempt of 1942 to the carnage of 1944 was more than just a shift in military fortune. It was the violent collision of 2 fundamentally different philosophies of war. In the beginning, the sky over the Pacific was a dueling ground, an arena where the masters of a martial art reigned supreme. Japanese pilots like Saburo Sakai, flying the ethereal Mitsubishi Zero, saw themselves as the inheritors of a samurai tradition. They believed combat was a test of individual skill and spirit, and their lightweight, agile fighters were the perfect katanas for this contest. They looked at the heavy, sluggish American planes with disdain, seeing not warriors but mere technicians in flying machines. They were convinced that their superiority was absolute, a spiritual certainty, that could never be overcome by the clumsy materialism of their foe. They were masters of the sky and they knew it. What they failed to understand was that America was not trying to win a duel. It was fighting a war of production, logistics, and systems. The first sign that the rules were changing came not from a factory, but from the mind of John Thach. The Thach Weave was a piece of tactical genius born from desperation, a recognition that if you couldn't win the duel, you had to change the fight. It replaced the cult of the individual ace with the power of the collective. It taught American pilots that their greatest weapon was not their own skill, but the pilot flying beside them. This intellectual shift was the crucial first blow, the crack in the foundation of Japanese dominance. It was a cooperative solution to a problem of individual inferiority, and the Japanese pilots, steeped in their warrior code, had no answer for it. Then came the hammer. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was not an elegant weapon. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial might, a machine designed not to dance, but to bludgeon. It was a fighter built around the most powerful engine available, wrapped in armor, and armed with an overwhelming barrage of firepower. It conceded the turning fight to the Zero, and in doing so, rendered it irrelevant. The Hellcat, flown by pilots trained in the cooperative tactics of the Weave and the brutal efficiency of boom and zoom, didn't engage the Zero on its own terms. It created new terms dictated by horsepower, altitude, and the crushing weight of 6.50 caliber machine guns. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the ultimate expression of this new reality. It was not a dogfight. It was an indue, sterile process, a grim assembly line of destruction where well-trained pilots in superior machines, guided by radar, systematically dismantled an enemy who was still trying to fight a different kind of war. The final statistics tell a story of total annihilation. The 19-to-1 kill ratio of the Hellcat is not just a number. It is the final verdict in a debate between two warring ideologies. The Japanese Zero, the ultimate dueling weapon, was rendered obsolete. The samurai of the sky, once the undisputed masters of their domain, were swept away by a tidal wave of steel and a new way of thinking. In the end, the Japanese pilots had been right about one thing. The Americans did not build a better dueling sword. They had built a factory that produced sledgehammers, and they had taught their pilots how to swing them in perfect, lethal unison. The Zero pilots had entered the war as masters of the sky, only to learn a terrible, final lesson. The sky was no longer an arena for warriors. It had become a battle space dominated by machines, and the nation that could produce the most and the best would own it.